So let's start to get a grip on our camera and begin our journey to getting off fully automatic. And to do that, what we use is our camera modes, which are listed here. I'm going to give a brief overview of them, but we're going to go into them in more detail. And just before we go into those camera modes, I wanted to emphasize the importance of ISO. So ISO is our light sensitivity, so how light sensitive the sensor becomes. And I mention it because it's such an important part. It's 1/3 of that exposure triangle, and it's something that you've got to keep in your mind. So when we're moving on to these programs, moving away from auto, we need to be continually aware of what our ISO is doing, whether it's on automatic or whether we're taking it off of automatic. And I'm going to be going into what ISO does and how we control it and the impact of that in detail pretty soon actually. So I just wanted to mention that. So moving into the main camera modes, you'll find them nearly universally on the top of your camera, and in fact from the old SLRs, film SLRs, this kind of thing hasn't changed very much. It's one of the few things, refreshingly, that hasn't changed with technology and the new cameras come out. You have this dial on the top of your camera with the different modes that you can change. Now the first one we want to do to take off of auto is move on to P, and we move on to P, which is for program. Now program is controlling all elements of that exposure triangle, so it's still very automatic. It's balancing that triangle for us, that exposure triangle, but it does give us the opportunity to do some overrides, quite a few overrides. So it's a really nice one for dipping your toe in when you're coming out off of auto, because you can switch to P and it's balancing all the light for us, but we can change things. So things that we can change are like the ISO. So in auto we have no control over the ISO, but in program we can take the ISO off of auto and change that if we like. We can tend to change some of the focus settings that we're going to look at later as well. We can change that in program. We can change some of the flash settings, which we're not going to look at, and there's things like exposure compensation which we can change in program as well, which is another thing we're going to look at later on. So program's a great kind of mode for dipping your toe. So if you were going away next week and you didn't quite feel confident enough to move off of automatic, but you wanted to have a little bit more control over your camera, P's a great setting for you. And really, you know, if you're doing anything important, or if you're just getting brain ache or struggling to get your head around some things, you know, just switch to P, relax a little bit and start playing with some of the other settings that I'm going to cover later on for you. So it's a nice easy mode to use that gives you a little bit of control. Now the other thing that program allows you to do, it allows you to shoot in this mode called RAW, and I'm not going to go into too much detail of it because it's a bit of a side avenue. But if you're wanting to take your photos into things like Lightroom and Photoshop and do big prints or anything like that, RAW is quite a more beneficial file size. So by default most cameras will shoot in a format called JPEG, which is a very universal and a very friendly format. So you just get the pictures straight from your camera and you can send them to printers or do whatever you want with them, and it's pretty good. But they're quite small file size, so you can't push them as much as you can with RAW files in Photoshop and Lightroom. Now RAW gives you these bigger file sizes which allows you to do a lot more with, but with that you can't do that in auto. So when you're in auto setting, it's automatically shooting in JPEG. So that's the kind of, I don't want to go too far into RAW, but if you're someone who is looking to move into Lightroom and get more from the photos, you want to be shooting RAW, and in which case you probably don't want to be going into automatic, you want to be going on to program or any of these other modes which will allow you to shoot in RAW. So that's a bit of a side issue there that I thought I'd just raise there. So moving on from program, let's move on here it's aperture priority, which is A or AV on a Canon system. I think a lot of Canon systems actually have shutter priority next, which is TV or S, but let's stick with aperture priority, AV or A. And what we're doing with aperture priority is we're controlling how much light comes into the camera, and the camera is working out how much light, how fast to open the shutter for, based on how much light we let in. So the aperture, if you remember, works a little bit like the pupil of our eye. It can narrow or it can widen to let more light in or less light in. And in aperture priority, we control how much light that lets in, and based on whatever we decide, how much light we let in, the camera will choose a shutter speed for the amount of time, to allow the amount of time for light to come into the camera and balance that triangle for us. Okay, so that's aperture priority. And when we switch to shutter priority, which is S on a lot of camera systems and TV on Canon, we're controlling how long we let light in for. So we choose our shutter speed, whether it's a really short burst or a longer amount of time that we let light in. And whatever we decide to do with that shutter speed, the camera will decide how much light to let in. So the camera is choosing the aperture for us and we're choosing the shutter speed. And so you can sort of see the relationship that's forming with these modes now and with that triangle. So the ISO, light sensitivity, the amount of light that we let in, and how long we let light in for. So in shutter priority, we're controlling how long we let light in for. The camera decides the amount of light that comes in. And in aperture priority, we control the amount of light that comes in, and the camera decides how long it will let light in for. So like I say, I'm going to go into each of these modes in more detail for you, so it will all start to become clearer, and why you want to choose one shutter speed over the other or one aperture over the other will all start to sort of fall into place for you. But this is a brief overview. So the last one is M for manual, so which is the last one on there. So we move over to M, and now we're controlling all elements, or we're controlling at least two. It depends on if your ISO is on auto, you're controlling two. You're controlling the shutter speed and the aperture, how fast, how long we let light in for, and how much light we let in. And then some cameras will actually not let your ISO be on auto, so it will move it to manual anyway, so you need to be aware of that. And in which case you're then balancing all three elements of that triangle. So you have to, when you're on fully manual, it's a bit more of a laboured process, because you're going to have to, if the light, especially if you're working in outdoors where the clouds are moving over the sun and stuff, the light's going to change really quickly and you're going to have to think on your feet. So those are the key modes that we're looking at. So aperture priority, program, aperture priority, shutter priority and manual. So all of those modes, the key at the heart of it is this exposure triangle. The light sensitivity, the shutter speed, how long we let light in for, and the aperture, how much light we let on for. And I know I'm kind of labouring this exposure triangle, but I'm labouring it now, I'm sort of hammering it home now so we can keep it in our minds as we look into more details in this next bit. And just before we go into detail on all these other modes, I just want to look at reading our cameras and understanding our cameras. Learning to read your camera is a key part to moving away from automatic, because you need to understand what your camera's telling you and how you're changing and adjusting the camera. So reading the camera is key. So if we turn our cameras onto, say, let's say shutter priority for now. So turn your camera on and let's have a quick look at this. So whether you're looking at the back of your camera or through the viewfinder, I tend to look through the viewfinder, but there's no advantage over it either way. I don't think it matters too much. And what you'll see is something similar to this. This may vary depending camera to camera what you see here, but the essential information will be displayed on your either on the back of your camera if you're looking for it like that, or through your viewfinder. And what we have first here is in the top left corner is our mode. So we're in TV on a Canon here, which would be an S on another system. And then going from right to left, we've got here the ISO. So it's helpfully highlighted here with ISO there. So that's our ISO reading, which is 6400. As I say, that number will mean more to you, and any of these numbers will mean more to you after the workshop, because I'm going to go through each of those individually in more detail. So that's our ISO. Now this is our light meter exposure compensation information, and it's a little bit of a tricky one, this one, because when you're in manual it's your light meter, And if you're in manual where you're controlling all three elements of that triangle, what you're trying to do is get this dial dead center. So as long as you're balancing the light okay, this should be dead center. If it moves towards this minus area, it means you're not letting enough light in. If it moves to the plus area, it means you're letting too much light in. But that's only in manual. So if you're not on manual, this should be dead center. And if it's not, it means you're telling your camera to do something else. So this is covered in my exposure compensation section, which you'll find later on. But basically, you want this to be dead center. Now, if you're looking at your camera and that's dead center in shutter priority, you're all good. If you're looking at this camera in shutter priority and your dial here is either moving to the plus area or the minus area, you're telling your camera to either brighten or darken the photo, and the pictures that you get will most likely be darker or brighter. And really you want to have this dead center for the time being. So if your camera is doing that, and I do have people come on my workshops where their camera is already set to -2, it's an easy thing to do accidentally on a lot of cameras. So if your dial is not dead center, that bottom dial there, what you need to do is just quickly go over to exposure compensation section on the download or on the video. Just have a quick look at that, get it back to center, and then come back and rejoin this section of the download. So hopefully all of you have got this dead center anyway. So that's your light meter in manual mode and your exposure compensation in all the other modes. Okay, and then we've got our aperture. So that's the F. Well, actually, some people might see an F in front of this number. So this is our aperture number, so how much light we're letting in. Again, we're going to go over this in detail later. And then we've got our shutter speed. So that's our key information that we need to know what's setting and what's happening as we start to look to balancing the light ourselves. But the key thing here really is not the details of each of this, it's what the camera tells us. So when we look at this in detail, you might look at some of these settings and think, but I need to change this based on this. But you won't know that now until we've gone into detail on the other modes. But the key thing is to identify each part. And if you're not quite sure, look at your manual and it all start falling into place quite quickly actually. The more you start looking through your camera, the quicker it starts falling into place. So the key thing here about reading your camera is to look through it before you take a picture every single time. Get into the habit of it. Before you take that picture, look through it, press that shutter halfway down, and pressing the shutter halfway down can be key because on this camera actually, ISO, when I look at the ISO, it just says auto there until I press that shutter halfway down. Press that shutter halfway down and it moves, the auto disappears, it's gone up to ISO 400. So I know that it's ISO 400. So remember to, before every single time, before you press that shutter down, remind yourself, look at the camera, what's the camera saying? What's the camera saying? And just look at those numbers. Even if you don't know what they're doing, just look at them and just make that habit of looking at them. Now, the other thing, and the more important thing to look for, is to look for anything that's flashing or turning red when you're pressing that shutter halfway down. So if I'm pressing that shutter halfway down and anything flashing at me, I need to do something about it. So we can do this, I'm going to do it later anyway, but you can do it if you move your dial on shutter priority really fast as it'll go, and point your camera at a dark area of the room or in low light conditions, you might start to see something flashing at you. If you go the other way and go up to, well, I'm going to do this later anyway, so you'll see. But the key thing is to look for anything that flashes at you. That's telling you that you need to change something. You're either going too far in shutter priority, you're either going too fast and not letting enough light in, or you're going too slow and you're letting too much light in. So this is the key, but this will all make sense a bit more as we cover a bit more detail. But the key thing to take away from this, look through that camera, look at those numbers, press that shutter halfway down, make sure nothing's flashing at you. Okay, so I know as we're moving in, You know, already it might start feeling a little bit overwhelming, but don't worry, because it will all start pulling together and making a bit more sense. Key thing to remember, just look through it, see what see what this is telling you, check there's nothing flashing. So look through the camera, press that halfway, nothing flashing at me, it's all good. Alright?